Sophomores, we are on 5.4, Global Migration, getting closer to the end, at the last one of our chapters in Era 5, the Modern Era. Let's get to our first word in migration, which is a big word for this section. Migration is basically people moving from place to place. Migration, people moving from place to place. What makes migration different than immigration? When you migrate, you move from one place. When you immigrate, you come into a country. So migration is moving from place to place. A lot of migration is going to be happening in this chapter. We have Italians who are migrating from Italy up here in Europe to Argentina. We've got Indian labor, which is going to be huge in this chapter, often a racist term, but called Coolie Labour, going to Africa, going to Guyana, going to Fiji. We got Chinese and Japanese labor moving. So lots of migration, especially with labor, as we see a continued movement of raw materials and workers going for work. And of course, migration is a big factor today too, as people are migrating from place to place, as we talked about with our fundraiser for the Syrian refugees. Some people migrate by choice. Some people are forced to migrate. Historical significance. In the modern era, we see more migration than we've ever seen before. For example, the population of India starts migrating over Southeast Asia, South Africa, Latin America, forever changing the population and demographics of those lands. That is the significance of migration. Let's get to our next word. When it comes to migration, push factors. Push factors are what push people out of a country. So push factors are what make you leave. It could be poverty, could be lack of jobs, could be an unstable government. But push factors are where you look around and you're like, there's not much for me here, or maybe it's not safe for me here, and I gotta go, I gotta get out. Something pushes you out of your land towards something else. This is very significant in a place like Italy, for example. There are push factors like lack of jobs, poverty, which push people out of Italy. In India, there's lack of jobs for many poor laborers, which push them out. In Ireland, we'll talk about the potato famine or the potato blight, where many Irish people are pushed out of Ireland and into America. Today, an example, Syria. There's violence, there's ISIS fighting, there's the dictator, Assad, and his military firing on protesters, which has pushed many people to leave their land. Historical significance, push factors lead to more migration and people moving from different places because they have to for safety or for economic reasons. Let's get to our next word, which is pull factors. What pulls you into another land? What pulls you to immigrate or to immigrate into a land or to migrate and leave your land? So what pulls you into another land? Safety, opportunity, stability, freedom, we see right here. In this era, a lot of it's going to be work. Many people are pulled out of their land, like people from India, for example, because they believe they're going to get these really high-paying, good jobs. It didn't really turn out that way in this era. They were basically made almost slaves to replace the African slaves. After the slave trade had become illegal. But pull factors are the factors that pull you out. So many Irish people, for example, wanted to come to America because they heard there was work in America, there was land in America. Many Italians were pulled to Argentina for the same reasons. There was work, there was land. So pull factors are what pull you to somewhere else. A lot of historical significance because pull factors will make people leave where they are from to live into another land. Our next term is seasonal migration, and this is when people want to move to one area, work there, and then come back. There will be seasonal migration that will begin in the early modern era, where people are basically planning to move for a season or two to make money and then come back. A lot of people in India, when they left, thought they'd be coming back home. They weren't really allowed to. Many people who moved, like Italians, moved to Argentina, for many of them there was a thought that they'll make some money and they'll go back home. Then they started to get used to their surroundings and stayed. So historical significance in this time period is many people were planning on going back to their communities. They were not planning on starting ethnic enclaves, and they moved back. Some people knew they weren't coming back, but many people were seasonal migrants who thought they would go, work for a year or two, and then come back home. And it's historically significant because many of these people who think that they're going to come back home end up staying in their country, like Indians in South Africa and Guyana, like Irish in America, or the Italians in Argentina are all examples of that, or even Japanese people in Hawaii. These are examples of some of them who are seasonal migrants who thought they were coming back home but stayed. Indentured servants. These are people of many different backgrounds who left to go work to pay to work in another land, and they agreed to pay for their cost of moving to this new land, that they would work for a certain period of time, usually a number of years. In North America, and what will become the United States and the colonies, for example, many people take indentures to agree to work 7 years, and then they'll get some land and be free. The Indian labor, that goes to, again, to South Africa, that goes to Fiji, that goes to many other areas around the world. They are on indentures, which means they'll work for a while, and then they will eventually become free laborers, and they can have their own land and everything else. Unfortunately, what happens to many people in indentures is they don't survive their indenture, or, guys, people kind of find ways to let them have them work longer. They say, no, your indenture's not done, make them incur some debt or something to keep them working longer. Many indentures in America, for example, were replaced by slaves, although Indians, for example, were indentured servants who replaced African slaves. Historical significance of indentured servants is that, like a lot in this era, we see people moving from their homes to new countries to live, forming ethnic enclaves, forming new communities that exist in their new countries. Durban, South Africa is a big example of this. Guyana, Fiji with their Indian populations, Argentina with Italians, American with the Irish, Chinese coming in. This would be examples of many cases of indentured laborers coming in, working for a number of years, then becoming part of a new land or a new country. Italian Argentines. This is one of the biggest groups of laborers who move in our modern era. What happens is there's not much work, especially in southern Italy, Sicily, and other regions around there. So many Italians move to work in Argentina, which used to have a bigger indigenous population. It was wiped out in the area before from smallpox, diseases, etc. So we see here in some areas of Italy today, we have like areas that are more than this purple one, more than 30% of the population is of Italian origin. So many places in Italy, we see, this is 1914, more and more Italians are coming in, 20, 30, 40% of the population. Today, a huge percent of the population of Argentina has Italian ancestry, which also explains why the Spanish you hear in Argentina is kind of this Italian-Spanish mix, especially with the accents. Also, very historically significant because we see a population from Europe moving into the Americas, into Argentina, forming a new life, forming ethnic enclaves. In Argentina, even more than ethnic enclave, a very large percentage of the population is Italian, which grows and has its presence felt in Argentina to this day. Coolie labor. Coolie is an offensive term, usually used for Asians, for people from India or even China. Coolie labor refers to the amount of people from India and China in the modern era who migrated to other countries for work. They were typically poor people who were told they could have jobs in other places, California, United States, for example, South America for China, for India, Guyana, South Africa, Fiji, and these were laborers who in many places were replacing slaves, African slaves who used to do this work. They were brought in, forced to work for a number of years, and then eventually they were given their freedom. And many times they weren't given their freedom, many times they died. They were also, for the Indians, for example, many of them were living in former slave quarters, actually, which was, they were living almost the same life that the African slaves were before them. This coolie labor is all over the world. It makes a huge impact in populations, South America, Guyana, South Africa, Fiji, even Australia, as population shifts happen in the early modern era, and we'll see large populations. Durban, South Africa, again, for example, has 1 million people of Indian ancestry. So they'll make their presence felt, and they're very significant in this era. The next two terms kind of go together, so you can kind of put these down quickly. China, There's Indian coolies and Chinese coolies. Chinese coolies first. Chinese coolies were Asian indentured laborers who went to California, South America, and other places to work on their indentures. Significant because they brought a population that become places like Chinatown later on. In many cities, they did a lot of labor in those areas. The other one we talked about already would be Indian coolies. This would be Indians who are mainly poor, who were brought in as forced labor in the early modern period as well. And they were brought again, Guyana, South Africa, Fiji, many of these places. It's important to know. You'll see more about it in the video. Australian penal colonies. Australian penal colonies were colonies in Australia where Britain would take their criminals and they would have them move them all the way to Australia to start these colonies for living. So basically their punishment was they were forced to move and live in different colonies in Australia. Now, much of the European or British population that will go in Australia at this time will be criminals, people who are in jail in Australia, and they will start the Australian civilization that we will see here from Europeans coming in. Many of them taking over from the indigenous Aborigines who were living in Australia for thousands of years. All right, sophomores, I'm going to stop the video here, so go to part 2, and you may continue getting your vocab down.